Hi, in this video I'd like to walk you through the basics of how to plan and implement a strong writing workshop. So please make sure that you watch these links that I'm sending you in this video as well as others because I'm trying to give you alternate ways of looking at this from experts in the field, in the case of Ralph Fletcher, as well as examples of writing workshops in action. The writing workshop is basically a block of instructional time in which students practice how to write with certain skills. Sometimes it might be how to write with voice, sometimes it might be action verbs, sometimes it might be descriptive detail, sometimes it might be aspects of procedures and revising or grammar. You always have one certain particular focus that you want students to learn in a particular block of time within that writing workshop. It can be used with children or with adolescents as they focus on strategies of pre-writing on up through drafting, editing, and publishing of a written work. So again, we start with pre-writing, and in different class sessions, we work on our way up through revising, editing, and publishing. Next, we're going to look at goal setting. So with goal setting, you always want to do your goal setting with good instructional objectives in mind, in the phrase of students will be able to blank or the learner will blank. Remember, this is good solid lesson planning 101 that you've been walked through other times. So make sure these are measurable, make sure that you can assess them. Expectations should be clearly communicated and concisely written out by you as a teacher. The objectives should be written in the form of Bloom's taxonomy. The objectives should be tied with Arkansas state standards. And you can see, of course, here's the links to state frameworks. Next, we'll talk briefly about learning environment. Remember that students learn best in a writing workshop when it is an open, welcoming learning environment where the students feel like they can take risk, they can afford to be wrong, they can work with each other, and they can learn together with you as the guide. You want to communicate very clear goals and expectations, be specific, create an environment in which there is genuine respect. Encourage students to meet expectations, high expectations, offer praise, but specific praise when standards are met. Next, we'll talk briefly about the curriculum. You want to shape the curriculum so that it is interdisciplinary and meaningful. By interdisciplinary, I mean, of course, you might have English tie in with aspects of history, or you might have math tie in with aspects of science. You can include issues and topics that are related to the student's background and culture. We'll talk about that as we get further into this discussion later in this video. You can challenge students to develop higher order knowledge skills. Remember the depth of knowledge discussion that we've talked about. We can shape the curriculum so that you are using diverse resources, digital, visual, for instance. Have students research aspects of a topic within their community. You can encourage students to interview members of their community who have knowledge of a topic that they're studying. You can perhaps provide information to students about alternate viewpoints of a topic that they're learning about. You can have students develop learning activities that are more reflective of their backgrounds, include cooperative learning strategies, allow students the choice of working alone or in groups. Next, we'll talk about introductory activities, which is very key. You want to get students engaged, hooked from the start, spark their imagination. So in these introductory activities, there are certain questions you can ask yourself. What can you as a teacher do to focus the learner's attention on the lesson? Can you tie this lesson to something that they've previously been learning? Can you state the objective for the activity? Make this related to the guiding question. So what are students asking? What are they trying to find out? And something that is relevant to their lives. Something they're actually genuinely interested in. The lesson is introduced in a logical and engaging manner. Students should know what to expect as well as is expected of them. Don't let the students be confused. Procedures should be very clear and precisely detailed for the students. Next, we'll talk about mini lessons. Mini lessons are designed to help a student develop their use of a writing skill. The lessons are very purposeful. Again, focus on one specific lesson at a time. Don't try to do everything about the writing process all at once. So improvement in the procedures used as skilled writers is your focus in a block of time. Improvement, for instance, in grammar and mechanics at one block of time, or concept knowledge, or creative writing, or use of sensory detail. Pick one at a time for a particular lesson. Each session should begin with a mini lesson. So the student should sit with a long-term partner while with the mini lesson. So you pair the students up together. The teacher gathers students in the meeting area next to their partners. The mini lesson ends with the students being sent off to do independent work. The students work, the teacher confers with them and leads smaller groups together. You want to, as students are doing their independent work, at some point, about halfway through, take a break and do a 5-minute mini workshop in there just to reiterate what the students are supposed to be learning. Ideally, as you're moving through, you should notice some things that you want to build upon, some patterns that you're noticing in the student work. During the mini lesson, your role as a teacher is to engage in whole group instruction at times, especially midway through, build connections between what they're supposed to be doing and what they are doing. Uh, Find little learning moments, teaching points for the students, guide practice for the students so the students are actively engaged, and link what they're learning to what they are doing. You want the students to actively listen to you when you are teaching explicit and direct skills and concepts, and then you want them to apply actively what they're learning as part of their writing. Importantly here, remember I'm talking about a writing workshop here, not a reading workshop. Workshops can be one or the other. Reading workshops have come under some controversy because if you have students do a reading workshop where they're reading for, let's say, 35, 40 minutes, but you're not necessarily explicitly teaching them strategies, concepts, skills that go along with their reading, the critique is that maybe the students are enjoying something that they're reading, but they may have chosen something that's not very challenging for them. It's a little bit too easy if you allow students choice. Sometimes students will pick something that's a little bit too easy. And if and you as a teacher, when you go around the room, you can't, it would be pretty hard to read every single book that's in your classroom library. So you might be helping students out with a book that you're not really familiar with. And if you're not explicitly teaching the students strategies and skills, the criticism on reading workshops is that they can at times become haphazard. That's I want you to be very careful in what I'm saying, though. I'm not saying that reading workshops are necessarily bad. I'm saying that they can be a little bit haphazard, but they don't have to be haphazard. A carefully planned reading workshop can follow with a very similar pattern as what I'm talking about here with writing workshops, with explicit teaching, followed by practice, followed by a mini lesson halfway through, followed by sharing of what they've been reading, right, along with assessment. So it can be something where you integrate explicit instruction, you integrate systematic practice, and you integrate um, direct instruction of concepts and skills in with active reading and active reading practice. And reading workshops can be very much guided in that way. So again, there are different ways of doing reading workshops. Some have come under more critique than others. It's a little bit of a controversial topic right now. But what I'm specifically talking about here for this purpose of this lesson is a writing workshop. Writing workshops have not really come under the same level of attack. For instance, Tim Shanahan, one of the Dorians of the field of literacy, Tim Shanahan would be quick to point out that there is a lack of empirical research showing that reading workshops develop skills, but there is empirical research, there is a pretty solid research backing the effectiveness of writing workshops. Um, and depending on different scholars that I could cite, there is some research supporting reading workshops too. It's just not the type of research that the National Reading Panel was looking for. Remember, we've talked about that before. National Reading Panel, which Tim Shannon was part of, was looking for empirical research, typically high N levels of quantitative data as well, with medical model type design in there, which is different than, let's say, case study or qualitative study or narrative analysis or ethnography. And so, yes, there is research. It's just not behind reading workshops. It's just not the type of empirical design medical model research that Shanahan and the National Reading Panel were looking for when it comes to reading workshops. So I want to be very clear about that. But for the purpose of this, I'm specifically talking about writing workshops. So you then get into anticipatory sets. A mini lesson generally begins with a short introduction or anticipatory set in which you directly teach the strategy or concept or skill that you want students to be practicing. If you want them to be working with use of vivid imagery, vivid detail in their writing, then you directly teach how to do that. The direct instruction is often an opportunity for you to model solid writing strategies that will then be practiced by the students. You can model the use of pre-writing techniques, for instance, by free writing in front of the class. You can model the process of revision or rewriting a draft in front of the class as well, depending on what stage you're at with the writing. Make sure that you give students a chance to work with mentor texts as well as anchor charts. A mentor text provides examples of quality writing. It helps students to study how skilled writers use strategies to be practiced. It's an example of a very high quality writing along the lines of what they're trying to do. An anchor chart provides information to support the lesson in the workshop. So it's timely tips, timely cues. If they're working on visual detail, then it's tips, cues on how to use effective visual detail. Next, we'll get into the independent writing part. So you want to start with, again, the learning environment. Give students an opportunity to find a comfortable spot to read in the case of a reading workshop or to write in the case of a writing workshop. Oftentimes teachers will kind of combine these where a reading workshop one day might be followed by a writing workshop the next day. During this independent writing, the work is one-on-one or small group. That you as a teacher will circulate, you'll observe what the students are doing, you'll ask timely questions one-on-one with the students or in small groups, you'll listen to what they say, you'll coach them along, you'll demonstrate how to do something, you'll reinforce with a quick little mini lesson or a quick little midway point lesson, and you'll give very specific encouragement in a timely way. You want to encourage students to self-select the writing topics with guidance from you, because ideally your students should be interested in what they're writing about. There are multiple possible forms of expressiveness, for instance, drawing or digital storytelling, for instance. You might move through the room to help students, or you can write while the students write. If you're writing while the students write, then you're modeling your own love for writing. The writing time needs to include opportunities to share with peers. These opportunities are also chances for the student to share their writing with you. Next, we'll talk about the mid-workshop that typically takes about 5 minutes halfway through the class period. You as a teacher are extending the mini lesson. You're reminding students of ongoing habits that you want them to practice. The students are pausing to reflect as they listen to you. They're refocusing and then they resume their writing. Or in the case of a reading workshop, they would resume their reading. Next, we'll talk about conferences. And please watch these links. The first link is from a professor named Carl Anderson about how to conduct conferences. The next one is by reading specialist Jennifer Saravallo about and this is basically showing you an example of reading conferences in action. You want to encourage the student to talk about the writing. Determine what to teach during the conference ahead of time based upon what the student is writing and thinking. Be flexible too. Help with the pre-writing or the revising or the teaching of grammar in meaningful context of what the student is actually doing. End the conference with instruction that helps the student become an increasingly skilled writer and an increasingly confident writer, self-efficacy. Keep notes from the conference that are specific enough to demonstrate that the conference is being tailored for differentiation of individual student needs. Track the patterns that you're noticing in writing. That's the thing. If you go around the room one day after another, and you're not taking any notes, you don't have any kind of journal that you're keeping, you're losing valuable information. If you're keeping a consistent journal of your observations, then you can go back, you can study that journal, you can find trends that can inform your instruction. That's so much more valuable than just simply floating around the room with nothing that you're writing down. You want to track your instructional moves that you're making. Remember, scaffolding means timely tips, timely cues. It's assistance right in between what a student can do independently and the maximum that they can do with assistance. So keep track of your instructional moves that are like prompts and cues or think alouds that are particularly helpful to the student. That'll show you some pattern in your instruction that is beneficial to the student. Make goals together with the student and plan for possible small intervention groups as necessary. Next, let's talk about sharing of writing. Or in the case of a reading workshop, you would do share time with sharing of reading. The teacher, you, would gather students in a common meeting area, or vice versa. You would call their attention and they would stay in their writing spots or stay in their reading spots if it's a reading workshop. You would invite students to share what they're writing, celebrate their work that they did in meaningful ways. Sometimes you might even set up a writer's chair, a kind of a place of honor where they can share this. And students might also share with small groups together. Peer feedback is so important. Coach the students how to give productive peer feedback with each other. Make sure that they're not embarrassing one another or discouraging to one another. Like I was just saying, an honored place for sharing or writing may aid the conversation. A special author's chair, sharing with a group, special place where they might sit with you. Next, let's talk about assessment. As always, with good instruction, your learning outcomes should be clearly specified to the students. The assessment and the learning outcomes should be tied with state standards. The assessment should clearly detail the indicators to let you know that these outcomes are being achieved or not achieved, and the student should understand these. You want to identify how you will assess student learning, and the students should be able to identify how you are assessing their learning. You want to describe the assessments that are going to be used to the students. Don't let that be a mystery. Describe what aspects of student learning these assessments will target when you're talking with the students ahead of time. Describe how the use of the assessments will help you target your instruction to the needs and interests of the students. And again, the students should understand the basics of this. It takes away the mystery of how they're being graded. And if you take away that mystery, that helps the students feel like the grading is fair and it helps them take ownership of their own learning as well as their own grades. So some questions you can ask yourself are, how and when will you assess student learning throughout the lesson? How will you and your students know if they have successfully met outcomes? What is the criteria for mastery of the learning outcomes? Consider the use of, for instance, pre-test, post-tests. Next, let's talk some about English language learners. Ideally, with your writing workshops, reading workshops, if you can, on occasion have bilingual staff or at least one teacher who specializes in the language of that child who is a bilingual learner, it would be helpful. But I know that's an ideal circumstance. It's not always possible. The child should be exposed to models in both the home language as well as in English. That's, again, the additive approach to English language learning rather than the subtractive. Additive means we're building on something. We're not taking away the home language. Subtractive means we're basically taking away the home language and substituting English, with the child potentially losing the home language and getting the hidden curriculum that the home language is not valuable. I'm a fan of additive instruction, not subtractive instruction. Many programs and communities in which the children and educators have the same first language and background will use the home language while the student is learning English in a naturalistic setting. That may or may not be possible for you. Students will often start the year with the language of the children, then gradually learn and use more English as they gain more mastery of English, if that's possible. But the key thing there is find creative ways of using the child's home language as a tool, as a scaffold to help them learn English and to help them engage in writing. Um, Recognize that English language learners are acquiring more and new language skills, not just simply replacing or subtracting their home primary linguistic skills. Give many opportunities for language in many meaningful social interactions and responsive conversational experiences. Allow the students to feel like they're invited, like they're welcome. You don't want them to feel like they have to disavow their own cultures or their own home language. Welcome the English language learners into the writing workshop, into the classroom community. The first language can be perhaps seen on the screen or in subtitles. You can consider allowing the second language learner to contribute to conversation in the first language using, for instance, translation tools that are often easily available on the cell phone um, or other digital tools. Build relationships and mutual trust and draw on mutual experiences of the English language learner as an asset, not a deficit. Next, we're going to talk about culturally responsive pedagogy. And as an aspect of talking about culturally responsive pedagogy, we'll also talk some about blending in hip-hop based pedagogy as part of a writing workshop. And if you watch the links that I've provided, you'll see examples of how this can be done in action, especially um, Dr. Emden, Chris Emden, out of Teachers College, Columbia University, does a really good job of showing that in action with science education. So culturally responsive teaching in a nutshell is basically integrating diverse ways of knowing and understanding and representing information that are meaningful to the student's home social culture. You want the instruction and learning to take place in an environment that encourages different multicultural viewpoints and allows for the inclusion of knowledge that is relevant to the students. Learning happens in culturally appropriate social situations, so the students feel welcome, invited, valued. Relationships among students and teachers are in accord with the students' own cultures. You want to nurture and support competence in both home and school-based cultures. because obviously the school culture has a very definite set of rules and procedures by which the school operates. There's room for both to be respected. You want to recognize the importance of including students' cultural reference points. Allow a student who perhaps uh, knows a great deal of, or whose home language is Spanish to perhaps contribute to teaching of lessons if you're reading a fictional novel that involves background that's relevant to that student's culture. Dialogue matters. Aim for learning through genuine communication with that student. And mutual respect matters. Not just this fake respect, but real, true respect. Students know what's real and what's not. Next, we'll talk some about blending hip-hop based education into writing workshops. Hip-hop based education is a way of authentically and practically incorporating the creative elements of hip-hop into teaching and inviting students to have a connection with the content while meeting them on their cultural turf by teaching to and through the realities and the experiences of students. Now, remember something here. With hip-hop based education, this is largely talking about urban settings with students who might be familiar with and comfortable with hip-hop based education. The type of instruction that you use to be inviting with students is very much based upon the backgrounds and interests of your students. The type of strategies that I'm using here would depend upon which students you're talking about. Obviously, with the hip-hop based education I'm going to be talking about right now, it is based largely on teaching African American students. Now, if we're talking about, for instance, students in a predominantly white uh, area that is largely rural, that where the students and possibly the parents might be hostile to hip hop based education, then this might not work so well. If you're teaching students of cultural backgrounds who are from, let's say, Asia or Asian American, and there is a difference between Asian and Asian American, then you would want to adjust your instruction accordingly to that student's background. Very hypothetically, if you're talking about young Asian or Asian American students who are fans of, let's say, K-pop or Chinese pop or Japanese pop music. Hip hop is a global phenomenon, and it's been very, very influential in that style of music, especially K-pop and Chinese popular music. And there's an actually very, very popular form of Chinese hip hop in China, for instance. So if you're teaching Asian students, young teenagers, you might be able to modify these strategies that I'm going to be talking about for your Asian students, hip hop based education, but the music you choose that might be uh, really inviting to the students might be Asian based hip hop in their cases, possibly. So, again, vary your instruction based upon the interests and the passions of your students. This is not intended to be a one-size-fits-all design for all students. Hip-hop based education is a process of learning and or utilizing the complex nuances of communication that can be found in hip-hop and valuing of student culture if that student's culture is influenced by hip-hop. You can use hip hop as a tool to examine, for instance, injustices and to promote social justice and youth activism. That's a very common thing in hip hop based education. You can use critical hip hop pedagogy to critique the education system itself, perhaps. You can do this as part of a writing workshop. You can encourage students to ask critical questions. How are social relationships in this particular situation that we're studying constituted? How are power and ideologies woven into educational practices or everyday lived experiences that the students are investigating? How are life experiences limited or expanded upon based upon certain opportunities that are available? How can I, as a teacher, help students develop into critical thinking skills? You can encourage students to conduct action research studies with field notes, video footage, photographs, interviews, surveys, for instance. Ethnography is a very popular way of doing that. You can encourage students to engage in, for instance, imaging. Imaging is an instructional tool very popular in hip-hop based education. It's a process by which hip-hoppers reproduce or evoke images, events, people, and symbols for the purpose of placing past ideas into closer proximity with the present. What you can do on your own is you can perhaps watch this old video. This is from my youth. I used to enjoy this video when I was young by a group called Arrested Development called Tennessee, and figure out what important images from the past place past ideas into proximity with the present from this video. Then on your own, you can perhaps read the lyrics to Tennessee by Arrested Development. You can just easily do a lyric search on your own. Then you can perhaps practice doing a quick write response to the following question. Based upon the lyrics, how are power and ideologies woven into everyday lived experiences as expressed and described by the opinions within the lyrics? Again, that gives you an example of something you can do with students too. Like I was saying, hip hop is a global phenomenon, so I wanted to give you an example of how you can expand this approach with students of various cultures. For instance, you can watch the video Stranger in the North about immigration and homeless issues in Beijing that was originally written and composed by, in Asia, a very popular Malaysian and Chinese hip hop artist named Namway. This video that I've linked here has English translation so that you can follow the words around, even though it was originally in Mandarin. You can, again, the question that you can be asking yourself as you watch this would be, what important images place past ideas into proximity with the present? And you can then, as students practice spotting this imagery, they can then practice doing that in their own writing later. How are power and ideologies woven into everyday lived experiences as evoked within imagery within the video? On your own, similar to what I suggested you could do on your own with the Arrested Development video. You could read the English translated lyrics to Stranger North by Namway, then do a quick write response to the following question. Based upon the lyrics, how are power and ideologies woven into everyday lived experiences? And a side note with that video, homelessness is a very serious problem in Beijing, and immigration is a very serious problem in Beijing. Many, for instance, Namway is native of Malaysia. There are many impoverished Malaysians who immigrate into China and especially Beijing, trying to seek a better life, and then they struggle. And so the question is, what do we do about this? And not to mention, remember, Namway is Malaysian, not Chinese. He's not limited by trying to please the local Chinese Communist Party with Xi Jinping. But so he's also drawing some attention here to uh, some differences between the message of the Chinese government and the reality of lived experiences. That's often a long tradition that you find in hip hop lyrics and hip hop culture and hip hop songs going way back. Next, we'll briefly talk about resources. You can contact literacy focused nonprofits, including um, local state organization, Arkansas Literacy Association, Missouri Literacy Association, for example. You can contact the local library system. You can partner with state and local branches of International Literacy Association or NCTE to seek possible ideas, partnerships, and maybe even resources. You can perhaps start a campaign focused on the ideas that you're doing, and you can encourage people to share resources as well as to possibly even donate, a GoFundMe type thing. You can perhaps create videos and podcasts for educators and families about how to foster literacy development, include resources and recourse for perhaps sharing and a funding component to that. Many teachers are getting very um, creative with this because let's face it, doing writing workshops and reading workshops, when you talk about all the resources that can really make them good, if you're doing it for years, it can get expensive. So that's where when you gather up the resources, you've got you've got better opportunities to do things in really rich, neat ways. So hopefully this was worth it to you. Here is some sharing and finding of resources. All of these sites that you have give you examples of where you can find and use resources for instance, digital storytelling and writing workshops. And here are some more resources for engaging students in writing workshops that are digital, in which students might, for instance, create virtual storybooks. So hopefully you enjoy this. Take care.